The next story I wrote it. No, I didn't write it. Hello everyone and welcome back. Over the last week, I reread 5 of my favorite or memorable short stories from my youth, and I wanted to talk about them. I love reading short stories. I mostly read them in middle school and high school for my English literature classes because they were smaller and easy to digest in that sort of academic environment. However, I really love that small, perfect little short story that has so much in it in such a short amount of time. I want to read a lot of different things. I have a lot of different interests. I like many different genres, and short stories are very helpful with that because I can read a bunch of different genres pretty quickly. So I can read a different one every day, which is really fun. I also like that a lot of them tackle really big ideas in such a small way, and I really love that juxtaposition and how the authors choose to handle that, because that is quite a large task to try and fit this complex idea in a small setting. I reread these and we'll talk about them today in the order that I originally read them. I just wanted to come back for the nostalgia today. The first short story that I have memories of is There Will Come Soft Rains by Bradbury. And I have a weird relationship with this story because I read a selection of it, an excerpt from it, on a standardized test I took when I was like 10 or 11. But in the standardized test, it wasn't really presented as an excerpt from a short story. It didn't give any like background of what had happened before that point because the excerpt is like the last couple paragraphs. Really, they just wanted us to read it and like talk about the symbolism and whatnot from the paragraph or two, but I always thought it was really cool and I wanted to know how we got to that point in the story. I thought it was really interesting. It centers around a conflict that is man versus nature, which is my favorite type of conflict. I love reading about that. I think it's great. It explored a lot of those ideas, and it mainly explores Cold War anxieties, which is I have lots of books that I really like that also explore those same type of anxieties of like the world might end tomorrow and what would happen after that. So I really liked this. If you haven't read it before, this is a short story about a nuclear event where everyone dies and humanity is done, but there is still a smart house that exists and is continuing on. And what happens with that, because it's not just going to be any old day for that smart house. Kind of a random thought about it is I spent a lot of the time being reminded of Smart House, the 1999 film, which is vastly different. It's very, very different. They do not explore the same themes at all, but it just got me thinking about smart houses. And this story is, in this edition, is set in 2026, which is in a few short years. We already have pretty smart houses, so by 2026 I imagine we'll have really smart houses. I'm sure many rich people already do have like pretty smart houses, but it kind of freaks me out, and reading this story I was like, oh yeah, interesting. I'd recommend reading it. It's about 5 pages long, so it is a pretty short little one. The next short story I read was After 20 Years by O. Henry. And this short story holds a very special place in my heart because it's the first short story I read where I was like, oh yes, that is a short story, because we had learned about short stories when I was 11 years old, and before then I just thought, oh well, the stories that we read in school are shorter because they're for children. Like when I read Magic Tree House, it's like this thick, but then if you're an adult and you read adult books, they're like much thicker. So clearly the stories that we're reading in school are shorter because they're for kids. And so I thought it was really cool that there were like short stories for any age. I thought that was amazing. And this short story is the shortest of them all. It's only 3 pages, without giving too much away because it's only 3 pages. It's about 2 friends who are about to like go off on their life journey. And so they decide, let's meet back here in 20 years and see where we're at. And so the story is just about their meeting after those 20 years. And because O. Henry wrote it, there's a classic kind of ironic twist at the end. If you haven't read O. Henry before, I would recommend The Gift of the Magi for that iconic, classic O. Henry twist of like, oh my goodness. But this story has it too, and it's only 3 pages long. And so I think this story is a great example of something doesn't have to be super long to be really amazing. I remember this story so much. I think about it all the time. It's one of my favorites. I think everything has its like perfect length, you know? And for some things that's like 15 books, and other things it's 3 pages, and I liked this one. The next short story I read was The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. I do want to say that the entire time I want to say The Fall of the House of Usher. There's no reason it should be Usher. This one was the longest one I read this week. It's 25 pages. It's a pretty classic spooky story from Edgar Allan Poe. This unnamed narrator goes to visit his friend, Roderick Usher, who he hasn't seen since childhood, but Roderick sent him this kind of creepy letter that's like, things are not well. So he goes to the house and he's living with them, and things get creepier and creepier and creepier until you get to the scary finale. I reread this story because I have memories of it being terrifying as a youth. In English class, we read this in 2 parts. We read one part one night and the second part the second night. And I remember the first one being like, oh, this is fun. It reminds me of like Frankenstein and Jane Eyre and like that kind of like spooky-ish setting. I was like, ooh, this is fun. And then the second night, I was like, this is terrifying. Will I ever be able to sleep again? So I want to reread it to see if I still think it's scary. And then spoiler alert, I do not. I don't think it's scary. That might be because I consumed a lot more scary things recently. Like in the past few years, I've watched horror films, which is something I never used to do. And I read like Mexican Gothic, which was my first thriller book, thriller horror. Genres are confusing to me. Reading this story again was kind of like whatever. But if you have not read scary things, or you're not like the hugest fan, or you don't like super scary things, this is terrifying. The next short story I read was The Jilting of Granny Weatherall by Katherine Ann Porter. This is a short story about a woman, Granny Weatherall, who is on her deathbed, and it's kind of the semi-stream of consciousness experience of her last day. I say it's semi-stream of consciousness because it follows a really convoluted path of like her memory and what's going on. Time is whatever it happens to be. You can tell she's incredibly disoriented, but also it's like constructed in sentences rather than a true stream of consciousness that is just a lot of words and nothing really makes that much sense. So I remember really liking the story partially for that reason. When I think about movies that I like to watch or TV shows, they often don't follow a linear time structure, or they're kind of weird, or things don't like make a ton of sense. And so I really liked that in this story. I also think it's a really interesting view of someone's last day. You can really tell that Granny Weatherall, she has such character, but this is like the end. But internally, she still has so much of that character, and I really loved that character, and I really liked it. I think it's great. It's about 10 pages long, so it's pretty short. The last short story I read was Araby by James Joyce. My memories of this short story have nothing to do with what this short story is about at all. That was a time or two. I think I liked the writing style, I liked the feel, I liked the theme, like the imagery, but I don't think I paid enough attention to what was actually going on. I thought this was a short story about some kids playing football. It is not. That being said, I really enjoyed this reread. I thought it was really fun. This is about 5 pages long, and it's about a young boy who is in love with his friend's sister. It's a pretty classic story of like kids being like, what is love? Is love what I think it is? And then coming to terms with that in a pretty short little way. This story is from James Joyce's short story collection, The Dubliners, which I've also read The Dead from, and so after reading Araby again and enjoying it more because I paid more attention and knew what was going on, I think I would like to read the rest of The Dubliners. Those are the short stories that I read this week and that I remembered from my youth. If you have any favorite short stories, either from your youth or now, or if you read these short stories and you have any thoughts or feelings about them, whether you reread them recently or not, I would love to know. I am looking to read some more short stories and broaden my horizons, read some new authors, try some new things. It's one of my favorite things to do with reading is like, what else can I find out there? So if you have any recommendations, let me know. I think that's all for today. I will see you again soon, and until then, I hope that you read a good book. So, someone's calling me.